morning, everybody, and can I especially acknowledge the chair of the Hasanah Forum and trustees, management staff, grantees, all participants, distinguished guests at this amazing forum, and how wonderful it was to see the traditional culture of Malaysia welcoming us to the hall today. I'm really extremely appreciative of being asked to speak at the forum with its very important theme of philanthropy that listens, bridging intent with intervention. I know that everyone here is very aware of the incredible challenges which face our world. I'm a member of a grouping called the Elders. Actually, when they asked me to join, I said I'm really too young to be an elder. But we are a grouping of former leaders, and we talk about, or use the phrase, the existential threats to humanity, like the threats of nuclear weapons, climate change, pandemics, and even the fast evolution of artificial intelligence, which has so little, if any, governance around it. And each of these threats need to be addressed by more effective global governance and cooperation, and by committed governments and civil society. But then we add to those big existential overriding threats all the other ongoing challenges of great inequality, which I know Hasanah is very focused on the threats to our lands, our rivers, our ocean ecosystems, of air pollution, which is such a major killer around our world, as are the non-communicable diseases, and the many deadly conflicts which are impacting on so many populations, from the Sahel in the west of Africa through to the Horn in the east, to Afghanistan and to Myanmar in the Asian region, and of course in the Middle East. Philanthropy which listens has a role to play in how we respond across all this huge range of challenges, whether that response is in catalyzing better governance capacity and systems, supporting education and skills and startup entrepreneurship, in backing local action in response to community needs, or responding to health and humanitarian needs and supporting peace and peace building from the community level up, which is where it must start. Given the huge role which philanthropy plays in addressing humanitarian needs globally, I want to dwell for some moments now on one of the most distressing crises in our world today, and that is the unfolding famine and genocide in Gaza. What is happening is beyond catastrophic, and I know this is of huge concern here in Malaysia. So with the former President of Ireland, Mary Robinson, also a member of the Elders, I went to Cairo last weekend, and on Monday this week, I went with Mary up to the Egyptian border with Gaza at Rafah. And we stood at that eerily quiet border crossing where no people and no vehicles are allowed by the occupying force on the other side to leave or to enter. We saw trucks loaded up with food and medical supplies which had tried to access Gaza by a nearby route, and they were turned away for no valid reason. And when we stood there, we stood knowing that on the other side of the border there is a population of some 2 million people who live under blockade and siege, threatened every day by bombings, malnutrition, starvation, disease, and untreated medical conditions. How many times have we heard the world say, never again, after the genocides of World War II, Rwanda, Srebrenica? Yet here we go again. This horror unfolds before the world's eyes, and so little has been done to stop it. We visited warehouses where humanitarian supplies from around the world are brought together in the hope of delivery to Gaza. But not a lot gets through. We saw the consignments of the oxygen tanks, the wheelchairs, the crutches, and more medical and disability supplies, which had been turned away. We went to a local hospital where we met patients and their families from Gaza, evacuated before the end of the last ceasefire in March. We met a man there with his mother. He was blind because the bomb that hit him destroyed his optical nerves. Another elderly victim could neither stand nor speak, and a mother was there with her 3 children after becoming very ill in a tent encampment which had been bombed. In our briefings with the humanitarian agencies in Cairo, we were presented with so many formal statistics, and we began on our visit to get insights to what lies behind the numbers. Numbers can be faceless, but you look into the eyes of people. We know that 36 children in Gaza starved to death last month alone. We know that over 320,000 children under the age of 5 are at risk of severe malnutrition. A horrifying statistic, the birth rate in Gaza in the first half of this year has dropped by over 40% compared with last year. The life expectancy for women and girls is down by 30 years. Over 28,000 women and girls killed from October 2023 to May this year. Almost all households face water insecurity. There has been no shelter material allowed to enter Gaza since March, yet 1.5 million people need emergency shelter assistance. And what we saw in the warehouses were the tents packed ready to go, which couldn't get through. So the situation we describe as a man-made disaster. But because it's man-made, it could also be ended by human intervention. And we are calling on everyone with the power to stop this unfolding famine and genocide to do so, because we see other conflicts being resolved, and that's good. The one between Armenia and Azerbaijan being the latest. But the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is one of the longest running in the world. It goes back to before I was born, and it can only end through negotiation for the internationally agreed 2-state solution, or what we witness today will happen again and again and again, causing immense suffering to the Palestinian people. Philanthropists from around our world, including in Malaysia, are responding as best they can to meeting the Gazan people's needs. And I hope the day will come very soon when our joint efforts can support the recovery of their communities and their infrastructure for truly sustainable development. For now, we must add our voices to the calls for a ceasefire and for the free flow of humanitarian aid. These are so vital for the survival of the people. So let me come back now to the broader economic, social, and environmental context in which philanthropy is operating. Around the world, many in philanthropy aligned their missions with the Sustainable Development Goals of 2015. These goals are very noble, but the achievement against them has been somewhat poor, with only around 16% of the targets on track to be met in or before 2030. The pandemic had a role in that, as we saw the health services struggle, the schools closed, poverty levels up. Many governments took on a lot more debt and have not been able to sustain critical spending on human development. Then we see the climate crisis becoming ever more costly, with more and more disasters needing response, more families and communities facing great losses, and still too little investment in adaptation and mitigation. We see the spillover impacts of major conflicts on the supply and the costs of basic commodities, taking its toll far beyond the epicenters of a number of those conflicts. Think, for example, of the impact on the price and supply of grain after the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the volatility of oil prices impacting right through the chain of production and supply when there's conflict spiking in the Middle East. So we have been in the perfect storm, even before the dramatic developments this year in global development assistance. The cuts to USAID have been widely publicised and are dramatic. But in Europe too, there are major cuts as the United Kingdom and European Union countries ramp up their military spending, with development assistance often the first part of the budget which is raided. The impacts of the cuts on global health, to take just one example, are likely to be more people dying of preventable and/or treatable disease, and a greater risk of not being able to respond effectively to new pandemic threats or to banishing the old ones like HIV/AIDS. I think it's probably fair to conclude that we are at the beginning of the end of the official development assistance era. And that is affecting everything from attempts at poverty eradication to global health, education, and potentially spending on our environment and conservation too. Of course, that era was always going to come as countries moved up the income ladder. Malaysia is a very obvious example of that progress. But the suddenness of the change this year has caught many by surprise, and it's left big gaps in investment which can't be quickly filled by low-income countries in particular. And it's also left the big multilateral international agencies and the international and national NGOs struggling to reduce costs and staffing in very short timeframes. So it's a time when there's a lot of rethinking about the form of solidarity internationally and the balance between that and national investment and action. The former head of the United Kingdom's Department for International Development, itself now abolished, has written that aid in the future will probably have 4 pillars. There will be the humanitarian, which sadly we can expect to be with us for a long time. It will be on global public goods. It will be on financing through the multilateral and regional development banks. And what bilateral aid remains will focus on a much smaller group of countries, probably the most fragile. But I believe that addressing the global public goods, like our capacity for pandemic preparedness and response and for climate action, will require new funding models which go beyond aid. It will require models like global public investment, where all countries will contribute into funds according to their means. All will have a say on the governance of the funds, and the allocation should be made according to need. These kinds of models have a lot of promise, but they need champions, and I hope they'll find champions among philanthropy. At the national level, of course, domestic resource mobilisation for sustainable development becomes absolutely critical. And that doesn't happen out of thin air. To get domestic resource mobilisation, countries need effective governments, vital for strategic planning, for policy making, for implementation. Driving out corruption is key, as is careful prioritisation of budgets. Enabling environments are so important for attracting quality private sector investment and for partnerships with the development banks. One of the initiatives I chair is in the extractive industry sector, Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, EITI for short. It focuses on supporting best practice governance in the extractive sector, a sector which globally has had too much association with a lack of transparency and even corruption. Our structure at governance and country levels and global levels is a tripartite one, where governments sit alongside civil society and alongside industry. And community voice is very important in the building of best governments in these sectors. We are hoping that Malaysia will join the initiative because it is such a major extractive sector player. I think at the level of the big global agencies, both the multilateral ones of the UN and the international NGOs, there's a lot of rethinking to do as we move to the post-official development assistance era. With less funding and with the steady rise in the number of middle-income countries, the role of those big agencies has to change to one of support for building national capacities and systems. And this applies to the big humanitarian agencies as well. From the time when Malaysia's very own Jamila Mahmood led the Secretariat for the World Humanitarian Summit of 2016, it was recognized that there must be much more support for building the capacity of local actors who, after all, will carry on the work long after international attention has waned. Their efforts need to be amplified, not displaced. In philanthropy, as in development and humanitarian work, the value of listening cannot be overestimated. We should never come to a challenge with a template for how things should be, but rather look to communities to define what their needs are and the support that they might find useful. My experience at the UN Development Programme was that the same applies at the level of government. Never come with a template. Listen to what the national priorities are. And then there can be a discussion about what kind of support or advice might be useful. But there's never any one size fits all. If we're listening, we know that context matters. One thing is very clear, that the philanthropic capital in the world cannot replace what has been lost in official development assistance, and it can't fill major shortfalls in domestic spending in low and middle income countries. Rather, philanthropy's role needs to be very different. It needs to be catalytic in supporting the systemic and transformational changes needed across the pillars of sustainable development. The big global funds and the development banks and agencies will play a role in supporting governments to apply systems thinking, for example, to the climate challenge. But philanthropy's niche may well be in fostering the innovative solutions for adaptation, for resilience, for mitigation from the community level up. Similarly, our governments must lead on developing the systems for stronger economies, universal health coverage, education, social protection, and much more. But in leaving nobody behind, in fostering inclusive and cohesive societies, the role of philanthropy will be absolutely critical, as it will be in supporting the role and capabilities of civil society. Top-down development, which is not in accord with the aspirations of communities, so often causes conflict and division. And we see it with big projects fast-tracked regardless of the consequences for communities, lands and forests and water supply. And then there are the voices of those who often struggle to be heard in many settings, of women, of marginalised communities, of young people, Indigenous people, minorities, the disabled, migrants and more. In tackling inequity, in expanding human freedoms and capabilities, as Amartya Sen articulated so well, all those who tend to be left behind must be able to articulate the future they want and be central to the design of the change which will help create that future. And I was thrilled to see this kind of thinking and the references to the work of Amartya Sen, the father of the human development concept, so central to the concept note for this 2025 Hasanah Forum. I think that the potential for philanthropy in Asia to have a significant impact is huge. So many companies in this region are doing very well, and there are fast-growing numbers of very high-worth individuals. We must encourage more of the legacy of that success to be reflected in philanthropy. The Asia-Pacific, of course, is a fast-growing and very dynamic region, but it's also home to nearly half the households in the world which live in poverty. Philanthropy has a role to play in ensuring that everyone can benefit from the region's growth and development. And this is positive for long-term economic and social stability as well. I'm told that Asian philanthropy already tends to work closely with governments and that funders are increasingly recognising that collaboration very much needs to be part of the partnerships with civil society and local communities too. And in that way, I think philanthropy can act as a connector between the local, the regional, the national actors to build hold-of-system approaches. Responding to the climate crisis is an obvious area of need for this. The ecological and energy transitions needed need to be fair and just transitions for people, or they will fail to serve everyone. As I said at the beginning, the challenges we face are many and formidable, but they are not insurmountable. In meeting them head-on, let's listen more to the communities on the front lines of the ever more frequent adverse climate events, of the biodiversity loss, of the deepening inequality and the conflicts. The insights and hopes of those on the front lines of the challenges should shape and drive the responses that we make. The result can be development which is more sustainable in every sense, and that is a goal to which we can all aspire. Thank you again for asking me to come to the forum, and I wish you well for these 2 days of discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, the Right Honourable Helen Clark.